Two, one. Hi, it's Dr. David answering a question from Ravi, which is, how does polio avoid white blood cells? And I think by that question, Ravi means, how does polio virus avoid the immune system, which includes white blood cells, certain kinds of white blood cells? It actually doesn't really avoid it. It does produce an immune response. Now, there are three what we call serotypes of poliovirus that classically have caused disease in humans. I say classically because of these three serotypes, these forms of poliovirus, today in 2023, when I'm recording this, of the three types, the wild types of type 2 and type 3 are not here anymore. They've been eradicated. But there are different forms of those serotypes still circulating around because of what's called the oral polio vaccine. There's also a form of type 1 that is derived from the oral polio vaccine, also circulating around. But also the wild type of OPV1, oral polio of poliovirus 1, is circulating as well. And that means today people can get the wild type of serotype 1, the vaccine-derived virus of serotype 1, the vaccine-derived form of serotype 2, and the vaccine-derived form of serotype 3. Of those, the most significant one today is the vaccine-derived of serotype 2. Second to that is the wild type of serotype 1. And researchers are working on ways to improve the oral polio vaccine so that this doesn't happen. But we also have what's called the inactivated polio vaccine. Now, I don't want to get too much into the woods on all this. It gets rather complicated. Both forms of the vaccine that we have, inactivated polio vaccine and oral polio vaccine, have saved tens of millions of lives since they were introduced in the middle of the last century. And so I don't want anyone to get confused and think that my mention of some vaccine-derived forms of poliovirus that can cause a polio disease, by that I mean paralytic polio, that is any kind of a criticism against these vaccines. These are wonderful vaccines. They work really well. But now we're trying to tweak things with respect to the oral polio vaccine, which in the United States and other developed countries, we don't use the oral vaccine anymore. We use only the inactivated polio vaccine. But since the question is about the immune system, I'm going to focus on, for the rest of this video, on what happens immunologically and how the virus causes disease despite the immune system, which I think is really what the question is. But what happens is the virus gets into a person through the gastrointestinal tract. It can be fecal to oral transmission. It can be from drops of saliva. One way or another, it gets down into the GI tract. It can cause mild disease there. It can cause like a gastrointestinal kind of disease, kind of a flu-like short-term disease from which a person recovers. Or a person may be totally asymptomatic at this point. But that kind of exposes the person, causing an immune response already, which initially is an IgM response, mostly IgM, and then later, as weeks and weeks go on, beyond that, you get more of an IgG component after that. Now, but while this is happening in a small percentage of people, about 4 or 5% of people, the virus can, before the immune system eliminates it from the gastrointestinal tract, it can get into the bloodstream, and from there, it can get to the central nervous system. So then once it's in the central nervous system, it can actually cause more severe disease than the kind of disease that's caused just by the virus being in the gastrointestinal tract. It can cause a type of meningitis, and in 1% of infections, it can actually cause paralysis. It can cause paralysis by affecting the spinal cord, and that's why the word poliomyelitis, which means inflammation of the spinal cord, is there. And it can affect portions of the spinal cord that affect motor control. In other words, to control skeletal muscles so that the person then could become paralyzed, even though sensory portions of the spinal cord are not generally affected. And this can happen so high up in the spinal cord, especially with serotype 1, that the breathing centers can be affected, which really is happening in the medulla oblongata and other areas of the brain stem, which is continuous with the spinal cord. And that's why people can become paralyzed at such high levels of the central nervous system that they need assistance breathing. And that's why you see pictures and videos of children and other people in the 1950s or the 1940s or the 1930s on an iron lung, which was actually invented during the 1920s at Harvard using vacuum cleaner technology. We don't really use those so much, and hardly ever. Now, positive pressure ventilation is what's used for people who need ventilatory assistance. So really, to sum up, the virus doesn't exactly avoid the immune system. In most cases, the immune system ends up getting rid of the virus, and then the person has immunological markers after that. But in a tiny percentage of people, it can kind of hide out in the central nervous system. The problem is it can cause some really terrible things, including paralysis.